I'm not entirely sure what prompted me to write this, except that I can't keep it to myself any longer. This isn't a dramatic cry for attention or an attempt to scare anyone. I just need to get it out to make sense of it, or at least let someone else try. It started with a project for a local historical society. As a freelance researcher, I mostly dig into archives, old maps, and census records. They wanted me to investigate a stretch of forest outside town, land slated for development but rumored to be haunted. Local legends claimed it was a burial ground, though no one seemed to know for whom or when. The forest was dense, its towering oaks and thick carpet of leaves muffling every step. Even during the day, the place felt unnervingly still, not peaceful, but held in a kind of tension, as if the trees were waiting for something. Using an old survey map, I identified a few likely spots where graves might be. My task seemed simple: find records, confirm or debunk the rumors, and move on. At first, nothing unusual appeared, just hours of scanning microfilm and deciphering barely legible handwriting. Then I found the entry. It was buried in an 1847 ledger, a simple mention of pauper burials conducted on the forest's edge. There were no names, just numbers, 13 bodies buried hastily and forgotten. The account described a fever that swept through the town, killing those too poor for proper burials in the churchyard. The townsfolk had decided to use a patch of land deemed unlikely to disturb. The deeper I dug, the worse the story grew. For decades, locals avoided the site after strange occurrences were reported. A hunter claimed to hear whispers when he camped there. A surveyor in the 1930s quit after finding human bones in shallow graves. Yet no official records marked the location. It was as though everyone wanted to forget. I've never been the kind of person who gets spooked easily. I've spent nights alone in libraries that creak and groan like they're alive. But something about this project got under my skin. I started dreaming about the forest, about roots tangled around skeletons and voices calling from beneath the soil. When I returned to the site with my notes and equipment, I told myself it was just work. There was nothing supernatural about it. People made up ghost stories to explain things they didn't understand. That's all it was. Still, I don't know why I strayed from the mapped areas. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to part, forming a natural path that wasn't on any chart. I followed it, stepping carefully over mossy stones and avoiding gnarled roots. The clearing I found wasn't large, but it was unmistakably wrong. The air was colder there, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones no matter how warmly you're dressed. At the center was a sunken patch of earth surrounded by a ring of stones that might once have been a crude marker. Kneeling to examine it, I brushed away layers of leaves. The ground felt loose, as though disturbed recently. Then I noticed the smell, damp and earthy, tinged with something sharp and sour. I told myself it was just decay, the natural smell of the forest floor. The first thing I uncovered was a bone. It was small, maybe from an arm or leg, and darkened with age. I should have stopped there. I should have reported my find and left it alone. But I kept digging. There wasn't much: a fragment of a skull, a tooth, and scraps of fabric so rotted they crumbled in my hands. Then, deeper still, I found a tarnished locket. It was oval, etched with a nearly worn-away design. Inside was a miniature portrait, barely visible but unmistakably human. The face was smeared and distorted, but the eyes seemed to pierce through the grime, painted with an intensity that time couldn't dull. Holding it up to the fading light, I felt a strange compulsion to keep it. That night I couldn't sleep. My dreams were fragmented, filled with shadows and whispers I couldn't quite hear. The forest seemed to seep into my room, the scent of damp earth clinging to the locket on my nightstand. The noises started the next day. At first I thought it was just my house settling or the wind rattling a loose shutter, but the sounds became more distinct, footsteps pacing in the mar, faint knocking that came from nowhere. I told myself I was imagining things, that long hours in the forest had messed with my head. When I woke to find the locket on my pillow, I knew I wasn't imagining anything. I had locked it in a drawer before bed, certain I didn't want to see it again. But there it was, the portrait staring at me with those unnerving eyes. I tried to get rid of it. I buried it in the yard, threw it in a river, even left it in a thrift store's donation box. It always came back. Every time I'd find it somewhere impossible, on my desk, in my car, once even in my pocket. The activity in the house escalated. Doors slammed on their own. Mirrors cracked without warning. The whispers grew louder, almost clear enough to understand. Once, I woke to find the wall scrawled with words I didn't recognize, etched into the paint as if by invisible hands. I don't go to the forest anymore. I can't. Whatever I disturb doesn't want me there, and I don't want to know what might happen if I return. The locket is still with me, no matter how many times I've tried to rid myself of it. I've stopped trying to explain it. Maybe the dead from that unmarked grave don't want to be forgotten. Or maybe they want revenge. All I know is that the whispers haven't stopped. They're louder now, almost clear enough to understand. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think I hear footsteps coming closer. I didn't grow up believing in ghosts or curses. I always thought of those stories as remnants of an older, more superstitious time. Even as a history student, I stuck to the tangible records, photographs, and artifacts. I was practical to a fault. But I wasn't prepared for what I found under that ancient oak. The university assigned me to a summer internship cataloging local cemeteries. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone claimed to know everyone else's history. My task was straightforward: document gravestones, note any weathering or damage, and cross-reference the names with historical records. It was monotonous work, but I didn't mind. The cemeteries were peaceful, and the archives were quiet. I'd planned to spend the summer saving money, finishing my thesis, and enjoying the simplicity of small-town life. The oak tree wasn't on the original map I was given. It stood alone in a field at the edge of town, its gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. Locals referred to it as Hollow Oak, though no one seemed to know why. It wasn't part of my assigned area, but curiosity got the better of me. When I asked about it at the library, the older woman behind the desk gave me an odd look. She quickly said that the tree had been there longer than anyone could remember. A few of the older records hinted at its use as a meeting place during colonial times, but nothing definitive. There was one story that caught my attention, though. In 1903, workers digging nearby unearthed human remains. No coffin, no marker. Just bones scattered beneath the tree. The site was never officially investigated. Instead, the workers were told to cover the area and move on. On my next free day, I walked to the oak. The grass was overgrown, and the air felt heavier the closer I got. There was no trail leading to the tree, just a vague path worn down by animals. Up close, the tree was massive, its trunk scarred with strange carvings. Some were initials or dates, but others were symbols I didn't recognize. The ground beneath the tree was uneven, almost like a series of shallow depressions. I knelt to examine one, brushing away leaves and dirt. It was subtle, but there were remnants of stone pieces too small to be headstones but arranged deliberately. My first thought was that it might be an old marker long since destroyed by time. I decided to take a few photos and measure the area, hoping to piece together its history later. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I combed through every resource I could find: maps, old letters, even parish records. Nothing mentioned burials beneath the oak, but the more I searched, the more I noticed a pattern: stories of disappearances, unsolved murders, and strange illnesses clustered around the tree's location. I should have let it go. My work didn't involve investigating rumors, and I wasn't being paid to dig up secrets. But something about that place gnawed at me. The next time I visited the oak, I brought a trowel and gloves. I convinced myself it was just a casual dig, a quick look to satisfy my curiosity. The first few inches were unremarkable: roots, rocks, compacted soil. Then I hit something solid. It was a small box, wood so rotted it crumbled at the touch. Inside were fragments of cloth and a rusted piece of metal. It took me a moment to realize what I was holding: a brooch, tarnished but unmistakably old. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the damp, earthy scent I expected. It was sweet and cloying, like something that had been sealed away for too long. I should have stopped there. Instead, I kept digging. The second find was worse. Bone, fragile and yellowed, but unmistakable. I froze, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The clearing was silent, no wind, no birds, just the distant hum of insects. I packed up and left, telling myself I'd report the discovery to the local authorities. But I didn't. Something about it felt wrong. Not illegal, but unnatural. That night I dreamed of the tree. The carvings on its trunk shifted and writhed, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark. Beneath it, the earth heaved as if something buried there was struggling to escape. I woke drenched in sweat, the faint smell of that sickly sweetness still clinging to my skin. The incident started small. Objects in my apartment weren't where I left them. Lights flickered, even though the wiring was fine. Then came the voices, faint at first, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I convinced myself I was stressed, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But one night, as I reviewed the photos of the oak, I saw something I couldn't explain. In the background of one image was a shadow, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. I stared at it for hours, zooming in, adjusting the brightness. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure had no face, just a featureless void where its head should have been. I haven't been back to the oak since. I know I should. I should mark the site, report it, do something. But every time I think about returning, I feel that same oppressive weight, as if the tree itself is warning me away. The whispers haven't stopped. Sometimes they sound like my own voice, repeating words I don't remember saying. Other times, they're fragments of prayers or pleas too faint to understand. Last week I found the brooch on my desk. I'm certain I left it buried beneath the oak. I don't know how it got here, and I don't want to. I've thought about destroying it, but some part of me knows it wouldn't help. Whatever I unearthed beneath that tree doesn't belong to me, and it isn't bound to an object. It's bound to the ground itself, to the secrets buried there long before I came along. I've started hearing footsteps at night, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside my door. They stop whenever I approach, leaving only silence and that lingering, sickly smell. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Some things are better left buried. The past doesn't always want to be uncovered, and sometimes the dead aren't as quiet as we believe. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll ever be free of that place. But I do know one thing: the oak is waiting. I've always been fascinated by old books, not the glossy, mass-printed ones you find in chain stores, but the kind that smell like dust and secrets, with cracked spines and ink fading into whispers. When I moved to a small town to teach at the local community college, I discovered an antique store tucked into a narrow alley. It was called Timeless Finds, and stepping inside felt like crossing into another world. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, greeted me warmly and told me I could browse as long as I liked. The shop was cluttered, with shelves groaning under the weight of relics no one had touched in years. I wandered past mismatched candlesticks, stacks of yellowed postcards, and tarnished silverware until I found myself in a corner devoted to books. That's where I found the ledger. It wasn't particularly beautiful, just a battered, leather-bound volume with no title on the cover. What caught my attention was the handwriting. The pages were filled with neat, looping script that seemed too perfect to have been written by a human hand. Flipping through, I realized it wasn't a diary or a record of accounts. The entries were more like stories, but the kind you'd hear whispered in dark rooms. Each one was brief, just a few paragraphs long, and described someone's death. The entries weren't gruesome exactly, but they were unsettling. One described a man who drowned in a pond despite being an excellent swimmer. Another detailed a young woman falling ill after visiting a particular stretch of woods. None of the stories had dates or locations, only names. I asked the shop owner about it, but he just shook his head. He said that the ledger had been there as long as he could remember, and no one had ever bought it. That should have been my first clue to leave it alone. Of course I didn't. I brought it home and started reading through it properly that night. I'm not sure when I realized the pattern. At first it seemed like a coincidence. I'd read a name in the ledger, and within days I'd hear about someone in town who had died in a way eerily similar to one of the entries. The first was a boy named Ethan. His name appeared in an entry describing a child who fell from a tree while playing. 3 days later, the local paper reported that a 9-year-old boy had died in the same way. Then there was Mrs. Lane, the librarian. Her name appeared next to an entry about an older woman collapsing while gardening. It wasn't even a week before I overheard someone in the diner saying that Mrs. Lane had passed away. I told myself it was all coincidence. This was a small town, and accidents happened, but the more I read, the more impossible it became to ignore. I thought about burning the ledger, but something stopped me. I convinced myself that it was just morbid curiosity, that I needed to understand it before I could get rid of it. So I kept reading, even as the deaths continued. One night, I came across an entry that froze me in place. It described a man who died in his sleep after hearing voices calling his name. The name in the ledger was mine. I shut the book and shoved it under my bed, telling myself I wouldn't touch it again. But that didn't stop the dreams. They started out faint, like fragments of conversation I couldn't quite catch. I'd wake up certain someone had been standing at the foot of my bed, though the room was always empty. Then the whispers became clearer. They didn't say much, just my name, over and over, in a voice I didn't recognize. I tried to stay awake, but the whispers found me even in the daylight. At first they came from the shadows in my apartment, then from the woods behind my building. I decided to return the ledger to the shop, but when I got there, the store was closed. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of the owner. That night I dreamed about the ledger. In the dream, it was open on my desk, and the pages were blank except for a single line at the top: "The story isn't finished." I woke up drenched in sweat and decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag and drove to a motel on the edge of town, leaving the ledger behind. For a few days it seemed like I'd escaped. The whispers stopped, and I started to believe I'd imagined everything. Then I opened my suitcase to grab a change of clothes, and there it was, the ledger, sitting on top of my neatly folded shirts. I threw it in the dumpster behind the motel and checked out the next morning. I drove for hours, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far from that cursed book. When I finally stopped, I checked into another motel and collapsed into bed. I woke up around midnight to the sound of pages turning. The ledger was on the nightstand, open to a new entry. This one didn't have a name, just a description of a person who thought they could run from their own story. I don't know how long I have left. The whispers are louder now, and the shadows in my room seem to move even when I'm watching them. I thought about leaving the ledger in the woods or throwing it in the river, but some part of me knows it won't matter. It'll find its way back no matter where I go. If you're reading this, and you ever come across a ledger filled with names and stories, don't touch it. Leave it where you found it and walk away. I wish I had. There was some. I grew up in a town that prided itself on its folklore. Ghost stories were as common as the changing of the seasons, and we all had our favorites. The tale of the old elm at the edge of the cemetery was the one that lingered in my mind long after I'd grown too old for campfire tales. The tree had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Its gnarled branches stretched wide, casting shadows that seemed deeper and darker than those of the surrounding trees. People said that it marked the spot of an unmarked grave, a place where restless spirits gathered. The details varied with each telling, but they always ended the same way. Whoever was listening would be warned not to disturb the ground beneath the elm. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but I believed in history. As a grad student in anthropology, I was drawn to stories like that because they hinted at something real, a forgotten tragedy or an unrecorded death. When I returned home for the summer, I decided to investigate. The cemetery itself was a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. The old elm stood near the edge with its twisted roots clawing at the earth. There were no headstones near it, just an expanse of grass that seemed oddly untouched. I brought along my equipment, a small ground-penetrating radar unit, nothing too invasive. My plan was to scan the soil, look for anomalies, and maybe piece together a little of the story. The first day passed uneventfully. The radar picked up a few irregularities, but nothing definitive. As I packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. A small pile of stones had appeared at the base of the tree. I was certain they hadn't been there earlier. I assumed it was a prank. Teenagers often hung out in the cemetery, and word must have gotten around about what I was doing. Even so, the stones felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. On the second day, I started digging. I was careful. I wasn't about to desecrate anything. The ground was dense, the kind of soil that seemed like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. That changed when I hit something solid. At first I thought it was a root, but as I cleared away the dirt, I realized it was wood, old, rotting wood, the kind you'd expect from a coffin. My pulse quickened as I stared at it. I didn't open it. I only uncovered enough to confirm what it was before filling the hole back in and leaving. That night the dream started. In the dream, I stood beneath the elm, but the cemetery wasn't empty. Shadows moved between the headstones and they seemed to watch me. A low, mournful whisper filled the air, but I couldn't make out the words. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in my room felt heavy, like the aftermath of a storm. The next morning I told myself it was just my imagination. The mind can play tricks when dealing with the unknown. But when I returned to the cemetery, I found another pile of stones. This one was larger than the first. I didn't want to admit it, but it felt like a warning. On the third day, I decided to stop. I packed up my equipment and promised myself that I wouldn't go back. But as I walked past the elm one last time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a carving on the tree, hidden among the knots and ridges of the bark. It was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. The carving looked old and weathered by time, but it was unmistakably deliberate. That night the whispers returned. They were louder now, urgent, like a crowd trying to shout over each other. This time I understood the words. The voices told me to leave it alone. I woke to find dirt on my hands. I hadn't gone to the cemetery, I was sure of it, but the evidence was there, smeared under my fingernails and scattered across my sheets. I stared at my hands for a long time, my mind racing with possibilities. On the fourth day, I stayed inside. I kept the curtains drawn and tried to focus on anything but the elm, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The shadows in my room seemed alive, shifting when I wasn't looking. That night I dreamed of the grave again. This time, the coffin wasn't buried. It lay on the grass, open. I couldn't see what was inside, but the air around it was thick with the scent of decay. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices repeating the same phrase over and over. They said that I had seen too much. When I woke, the dirt was back, along with something else. A single stone sat on my nightstand, identical to the ones that had appeared beneath the elm. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. On the fifth day, I returned to the cemetery. I didn't bring my equipment or tools, just a flashlight and my own growing dread. The elm loomed ahead, its branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the twilight sky. The pile of stones was gone. I circled the tree, looking for any sign of disturbance, but the ground was undisturbed. It was as if nothing had ever been there. I was about to leave when I saw her. She stood just beyond the edge of the cemetery, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Her dress was tattered and clung to her thin frame, and her hair hung in damp strands over her face. I froze in place as she raised one hand and pointed at the tree. My flashlight flickered and went out. When it came back on, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm. On the 6th day, I found the symbol from the tree carved into my front door. I don't know what I unleashed or if it can be stopped. The whispers have returned, louder than ever, and the shadows in my room grow darker with each passing night. If you ever visit the cemetery on the edge of town, stay away from the old elm. Don't touch the ground beneath it. Don't even look at it for too long. Some graves are meant to be forgotten. There was